In the Wild West world of podcasting, there is one podcast that is authentic and genuine and continues to stand tall in its originality. Based on a passion for his guests, their work, and his love of podcasting, Derek Thomas and Monday Morning Critic Podcast get amazing, diverse, unique guests found nowhere else. The variety and quality are endless. There is something for everyone. Derek Thomas is the hero you deserve. He's a silent guardian, a watchful protector. Welcome to Monday Morning Critic Podcast. Here is Derek Thomas.
Hey, we're in a little house in town. If you want to stop by and finish this conversation, you're welcome anytime.
Oh, I'd like that. I'll be seeing you.
Yeah. Soon, I hope. Ready to be done with this.
You'll never be done with it no matter what. It's going to haunt you, son, for the rest of your days. But you won't be alone. It's going to haunt me, too.
If you stop by, maybe I'll give you peace.
Maybe. Maybe I'll give it to you.
Good morning, this is Giles Nuttgens, and you're listening to Monday Morning Critic.
My next guest is a very talented cinematographer whose work includes Hell or High Water, Montana Story, and Enola, Holmes, just to name a few. Please welcome the very talented Giles Nuttgens. Giles, thank you for being on the podcast today.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
So there's a lot I want to ask you, especially your early work, which I find absolutely fascinating. The way you kind of get into cinematography. And Giles, I have to say, when I'm looking at your the way you became interested in cinematography, the way you really kind of fell into it, you saw a documentary being filmed, and just the idea of all these people recording and creating, that kind of hooked you in at a very early age. Is that correct, Giles?
It is correct. I mean, I have to admit that it was a little more than that. There was something. It seemed extremely glamorous to me, even though obviously it was a tiny documentary crew with a guy with a 16mm camera on his shoulder, but it just seemed a very free way. I think I was 10 years old. I was a lot less concentrated on the idea of an image or an idea of creating a story as something that seemed, quite an interesting way to make a living, traveling around. On that particular case, it was a thing about the Industrial Revolution in England. So learning something about history in the process, the possibility of meeting very, very different people and obviously working within a crew. The director's assistant was very attractive. What can I say? There are things that as a 10-year-old, they're sort of appealing in terms of compared to what a lot of us end up doing, which are sort of fairly basic jobs, where you're stuck in the same place. And I always had this idea that with something like that, I would be able to move around a lot more. The other thing that was clear to me was I was very practical with mechanics. So I fixed motorcycles and things like that. And so even from an early age, even to the point of, getting to the engine of my father's car, not to his pleasure, but with that, I sort of felt that there was something about a film camera, we joke about it being a bit of a sewing machine, was that a film camera is a very basic mechanical instrument. And optics are optics. I was absolutely amazed when I was quite young. We used to go to the Camera Obscura in Edinburgh when we stayed up there on our holidays. And the Camera Obscura was just incredible because you go into a dark room and you would see this projection without the need of electricity. It's just simple optics, a mirror and a lens basically projecting onto obviously very low level light onto a white surface. And you could see this living image. You saw a living image of everybody moving around in Edinburgh, as it was happening. And that seemed to me such a basic thing. In the same way when you look at a reflex camera, you can actually see on the ground glass, you see a moving image because all it is a lens, projecting onto a glass. And I just thought there was something incredibly beautiful about that idea of being able to capture an image so simply onto some medium. Obviously with the Camera Obscura, it's just a white screen. On film, it's film. And digital has sort of taken us away from that. That doesn't mean that it's less valid. I'm just saying that there is something less simple about it in the sense that, and something less real because the image has to be processed. So anyway, that's really how I sort of got into it. It was the attraction for something that could reproduce an image in that way, simple optics, the mechanics, and then obviously a certain level of glamour to the type of life that you would lead.
Yeah, and I'm kind of gonna hop around. That's a great answer, by the way. I'm gonna hop around a little bit, but as you've evolved, as you've grown, as you've piled up the experience, what do you love most about cinematography today? Is it a lot of those same things you just told me, or has the idea or your love and your passion, has that grown in a way that I'll let you answer, I suppose.
Yeah, I just think it's a very different world now, and you can't have 30 years in the business and then not expect you to have, and I'm not saying less enthusiasm, but not to approach it in a different way, because it means a very different thing. It's something that's kept you eating for 30 years, kept you interested, given you a goal in life to be able to achieve something. So it has it's not quite as pure as the idea of creating an image. There is no doubt that when I started, what happened was I actually went into the BBC when I was 19, and I worked in the studio in Glasgow, but I used to spend my weekends out with the film crews that were shooting on 16mm at the time. And that's probably the moment where I started to look at the idea of, everybody talks about it, it's about storytelling and things like that, but actually the realities of trying to construct what happened with the film crews was they would go out and shoot a 3-minute segment. And obviously when you're shooting single camera on film, it was your job to work out how you sorted out continuity, how you could actually tell narratively a story with images. And obviously the more complicated thing about film at that point was the sound was actually attached to the film. The sound, the magnetic strip it was striped film. It was actually down on the side. So you also had to think about not just where you would cut that image, as where you would cut that image and where the sound was going, because I think it was a 16 frame displacement. So it was a technical process, but at the same time you were creatively telling a story. And obviously, as you were the only person seeing through the camera, the amount of direction that you could take from the director was limited, because actually ultimately you were making all those decisions. And I think that's where, if you like, from that process, that was very, very stimulating, that process, in terms of the idea of having the responsibility to be able to communicate something in 3 minutes to an audience. And I think at that point, the idea of storytelling through filmmaking started. But certainly when I was younger and when I wanted to get into it, it wasn't really that. It was a series of elements that seemed very, very interesting to me. But it was something that I had in my head right through my adolescence. And I sort of just, in a way, I just got lucky about being able to practice that.
Yeah, and just touching on some of your early life, right? So the youngest cameraman ever, BBC. I mean, that's a huge thing. And I know you.
I think I was the youngest. I was the youngest cameraman at that time. There was one person who was a friend of mine who made it even earlier. I think he was 24 when he was made up to being a film cameraman. But yeah, at the time when I became a cameraman, I was obviously the youngest within the system. So at that time there was the idea of being able to be given that responsibility was a fantastic thing. But most of us had done a certain amount of practice in that, in the sense that when we were assistant cameramen, we were also out shooting on projects that everybody else didn't want to do. So it's a bit like being a co-pilot. You'd already got to a certain level of competence where you felt you were capable of doing that. Sorry.
And do you feel that a lot of that came with, because I also thought I read where in research where you worked with Andrew Dunn for a while. How many years was that, and how do you feel that has attributed to who you are today as a cinematographer? Absolutely.
So as I've never really had the chance to, obviously I thanked Andrew for his input in, and because what happened when I was in Glasgow, I met Andrew, and I did a certain amount of assisting, on specific projects, although I wasn't actually allocated to working with Andrew, which is normally how a crew worked in the BBC at the time. But Andrew gave me that opportunity and put a certain amount of faith in the fact that I was very young. And when he left Glasgow and went to Bristol, I followed him shortly after. So he was very instrumental in getting my fully fledged job as an assistant camera person. So I owe him a lot. The biggest thing I always say about Andrew is that I owe him the fact that Andrew had great ideas about where he wanted to go. So it was never, as well as sort of being one of the better DPs within the system at the BBC, and the BBC was producing very good work at the time. Andrew had done a TV series called Edge of Darkness with Martin Campbell, which had a massive amount of success, and he'd won BAFTA awards for that. But Andrew always had in his head that they wanted to shoot on 35, and he wanted to at least be part of the film system. I don't know how much he was tied into the idea that we'd end up in Hollywood, but that is exactly what he did. And so, by the time he was 40, he shot The Bodyguard, which was, a hell of a break, and it was a massive film at the time. So Andrew, as well as obviously giving me instruction in terms of how to behave professionally as an assistant cameraman, and obviously allowing me just by my presence to be able to see what he did, because obviously when I first started working as a DP, pretty much most of my references were the type of work that Andrew did. He also gave me not just the desire to go on and make feature films, or not just the desire to go and make feature films in the United States. He as well as that, he really gave me that the idea that it was possible. And I think that was a real problem for us. We were small people that came from a small town in a small country. And the idea of being able to go across the Atlantic and actually make your mark in the American system was pretty much impossible. I would look at the work of, whoever it were at that time, whether it was Connie Hall or Bob Richardson, the type of work they were doing was a world away from us shooting small bit, either documentaries or dramas on 16 millimeter. And very, very few people had made that transition. Very few people. Occasionally people had done some amazing work in the UK and then had made that jump, but it was very limited. And I still think it is very limited for the amount of Brits that actually do set up and work regularly in America. And I remember when I first went over there, almost everybody knew Oliver Stapleton, or almost everybody knew Andrew Dunn, because those were the Brits working in the independent sector. There were other people, working on the much higher, the bigger productions. But it was interesting how almost everybody knew those people because they were the Brits that were working regularly on independent cinema in the States. So Andrew, I owe, if not from actually learning about lighting, which obviously I did to a certain extent, but certainly the person that gave me the possibility to think that I could actually go out and work in the United States.
Wow, that's a great answer. And I want to touch upon two things that you said. First, for those listening, Andrew's most recent work is Downton Abbey, New Era, which he just shot. It's in theaters now for those listening. So clearly an established DP. But what I love most about what you said was not only does he give you the experience, but I think more importantly, Giles, he gives you the confidence, right? That's the big shining thing I take away from that.
Yeah, I think, and I hope, I've returned that in the same way that, you take people under your wing. I think we all have a duty to take people under our wing and become some form of mentor for them. And I think in Andrew's case it was very clear. It was just, he was trying to do something that almost nobody had done, to come out of working in television in the BBC on 16 millimeter and to end up shooting The Bodyguard. So I'm not saying nobody else has done it, but I'm saying not that many people had done it at that level. And so to have done that relatively rapidly, because Andrew was probably in his mid-late 30s when he shot his first feature film. But within a few years, having met Mick Jackson, he was out there shooting a really major movie. So that's the important thing. It's a bit like Barack Obama becoming president, isn't it? That you then hopefully realize that anything is possible. In a country where you thought it wouldn't ever happen. So when that happened with Andrew, I was very, very happy for him. And also Andrew did the great pleasure, that he did a great thing for me. He allowed me to come out on some of those shoots. So I spent a week with him when he was doing LA Story. And it was literally, for me, coming from the sticks, as Andrew we used to call it, was, I'd go out and I would see these major actors and Andrew dealing with that. And yeah, it was actually scary. I mean, it was always scary. I used to look at that and I think, where do you start from? Because the whole scale of it was something much, much bigger than we were used to doing in the United Kingdom, at least on TV. Even though we were shooting film, we were shooting on smaller gauge film, 16 millimeter. It was a very, very different process. And part of that is the fact that at that point I wasn't a DP, so therefore everything seems impossible and huge, and you don't know where to start. And then of course it becomes fairly automatic, at least where to start. But Andrew helped me massively in that way, simply giving me the exposition to a type of filmmaking and a type of professionalism that I hadn't ever seen before. And as you know, Los Angeles crews are very, very professional. I was very, very impressed, scared and impressed, but it gave me enough of, maybe confidence is the word, but at least enough to say that is something I can do. I can follow in his footsteps. And it's not like I was chasing after Andrew or trying to, get into the space that he was. We have totally, totally different careers. But that doesn't diminish my respect for him and my respect for the fact that he gave me that possibility, which is an amazing thing.
Yeah, and you also mentioned Conrad Hall. We'll talk about legends.
And these were our references.
Yeah,
and that's the important thing to think about. And unfortunately, sometimes people ask about contemporary references, and I get a bit lost on contemporary references because the people that I studied and the people that I grew up watching their work and being terrified by watching their work, I admit, were people of that stature. People who had a point of view about lighting, about camera movement, about framing that was very, very individual. And I think it was more individual in that way. And I'm not putting down at all the quality of work, because I think generally the quality of work now is way above where it was 30 years ago. Because for lots of different reasons, technical reasons, and also the type that, the medium that we use. But still, they were individuals, and every single person had a very, very specific style. And I'm not sure that that's so obvious now.
Yeah, that's well said. And one of his last movies, and this is out of nowhere, is Road to Perdition, which I think is one of the most gorgeous films ever shot. But I have one more story. I have one more thing to ask you about your life. Early on, and I've been dying to ask you about this for a while now. So I thought I read where one of your first projects was a documentary in the Brazilian jungle.
Yes,
and you spent time sleeping in sandbanks, eating dried flower and red belly piranha, which you fished for. So there's a couple questions I have out of this. The first of which is, what in God's name does red belly piranha taste like?
Okay, so that was very easy. I mean, I tell you, after 3 months, everything tastes pretty bland. But it's an extremely bland fish. It's a bland white fish. Yeah, as far as I can remember, it was a long time ago.
Right.
But there was a necessity in terms of having to eat. There was also the fact that there's something very entertaining about going out and fishing piranha, which I still think is sort of crazy. They're very small. They've got big jaws, but they're very small.
Right.
The reason why they strip the skin off you is because they have schools of them. There are 1,000 of them, and so they all nibble, and there you are without any flesh on your leg. Yeah, that's sort of what we had, and the whole project was an amazing thing for us to go off. And as I say, I think I was 23 or 24, so we went out. I got that job because nobody wants to go and sit in the Amazon jungle for 3 months eating manioc flour and piranha, which I sort of get. And I'd be quite interested to see whether it would be a thing that would interest me now. I hope it still would be, but it was an amazing experience for me. Obviously, I wasn't even technically a cameraman at that point. I was an assistant cameraman. So to go out there, and I think I'd done a few talking heads, lit people when they were sort of sitting still. but to actually go there and construct sequences. And that's what I was sort of explaining about that whole process about you're the only person seeing through the camera. So by definition, you have to construct the sequence. You have to make sure all of the material's there so that they can edit months later. And I do remember we had film operations managers, and Jim Guthrie was our film operations manager in Bristol, BBC Bristol. And when he saw all of the dailies, when they all came back, because they used to watch every single foot of film that you shot. So he sat there through 100 10-minute reels of 16-minute film projected. And to assess whether or not one had exposed it correctly, whether it was in focus. And he came, whether it was nicely framed or etc., whether I dealt with the light correctly. That was part of his remit, was to actually have an idea about the people that work for him and their qualities. And when I came back, and I'd done one sequence where we were literally chasing a thing called a jacare, which is a small crocodile, and it was handheld and basically out of control, the sequence. And he said, that's the only thing that shows that you're actually a competent film cameraman. The fancy framing and all that sort of stuff doesn't really mean anything, because if you think long enough, you can get to do that. But it's when you're actually in front of a live event and you're actually capturing not just the event, but you're capturing all of the cutaways that you need to be able to put the sequence together. And that's what I was saying about storytelling, but also about having responsibility for continuity and what's going to happen in the editing process. Because if you don't deliver the right amount of material, the only person behind the camera, then they're stuck in the editing room 3 months down the line.
Yeah, and from I suppose maybe it's whether it's related to camera work or related to just your will to be out there in 4 months out of your life. I mean, just that's a hardship if I've ever heard one. What did you take away about yourself, Giles? What did you learn about yourself in those 4 months?
Well, I think we all learned that because you're sleeping rough for that length of time. You're sleeping next to some wild animals at times. As I said, we actually slept generally in the middle of the river because there were sandbanks in the middle of the river, and that was safer and slightly less mosquitoes. But you find out about your tolerance. We actually found it fairly simple in many ways. There were times when we ran out of food, and then we had to go for food without several days. That was an interesting thing to do, to see how much you could actually tolerate certain levels of manioc flour, which is basically dried flour. It's a root that everybody eats out there, which is tasteless. So you do learn a lot about yourself, but you also, at that age, and the importance for me being out there was simply the fact that I had to produce this documentary, and it was my chance to prove to everybody else that I was competent in terms of controlling a film camera, exposing correctly. And of course, I was the only person. So obviously I'm the person loading the magazines, maintaining the camera, making sure that everything's documented, to the point that making sure that when I got back to Rio de Janeiro, that I put it on the right plane and phoned up the office and said, by the way, there's 100 rolls of film coming in, and I'd like to know what the dailies report is when it's processed. So it gives you an all-encompassing. I mean, I still can't believe that they put whatever it was, £50,000 in your hand and said, here's a ticket, go off to Brazil. And there you are with, I had 2 cameras, an underwater Bolex, and the responsibility for doing all of the customs work, crossing the border, getting the film back and getting us back, along with a sound mixer. So it was a very enlightening process. But the most important thing was that you came back and you thought, oh, I've actually produced a reasonable looking documentary, so I have that competence. Obviously, if I looked back on it now, I would probably just see error after error after error. But yeah, it was a sort of experience that you can't possibly have nowadays, because there's a certain level of accountability in the sense that we have phones and therefore we can contact people. Whereas in those days, we literally disappeared for the length of time. I think for about 11 weeks, I didn't have any contact with work back in England.
Yeah, I mean, that's an amazing story to be out there under those conditions and to create a project under those conditions. To me, just is remarkable, Giles.
Yeah. I mean, there's a director as well. And the director was very strong and had a good idea about what he wanted to do. And there was just, it's like I was never in the military, so I don't know, but I imagine it's that sort of connection, because you have to rely on each other.
Yeah, so I did want to touch upon a couple entries in your wonderful filmography. The first of which is Hell or High Water, BAFTA nominee, perhaps one of the best movies I've ever seen in my life. And the way it's shot, Giles, it's one of the most stunning movies I've ever seen, certainly all around. But from what you've created in that film, really, and I'm being very truthful here, just blew me away and still blows me away today.
Yeah. So what can I tell you about Hell or High Water? Well, obviously, I'd worked a lot. I'd started the most important film I did, I think, in terms of starting my career. Besides obvious things like working on Star Wars, was Young Adam that David Mackenzie directed, which was his second film, but his first film was on some form of tape medium. But it was his first film on 35mm film, with very well known actors and with quite a reasonable budget for that time. And so it was a very complex piece of work, and it was very difficult for both myself and for David. David was extremely well prepared, and he'd lived with the script for a long time. And I think Seamus McGarvey was going to originally do it. I think that was the idea, and Seamus couldn't do it for some reason. So because through a few contacts, I got hold of the script, and I actually went up and said to David, I would really like to do this. It's probably the only time I've actually gotten a plane and forced a director to have an interview with me, because I was so taken with the script. And I think that process, which wasn't easy for David or myself, I've actually got a picture on my mantelpiece, which is David and myself in one of the locations, both looking very stressed, it formed something between David and myself, because I think we're actually quite similar characters, even though we have very different accents. We were both born in Scotland, and we're both relatively timid, but we can be quite forceful at the same time. So I think that was the thing that took us together. We'd done other films obviously together, and so when Hell or High Water came up, and with the possibility of working with actors like that, and with probably wasn't quite as obvious on the first reading the script, but then you realized how talented Taylor Sheridan is as a writer. I mean, it's just an amazing opportunity. But I do think it's an opportunity that it would always produce a good film with good actors, because it had a fantastic piece of writing. But I do think the presence of David took it to a different level, and took it to a level where I think we're all very, very proud of. But for me, it was a direct contact with Young Adam in terms of the quality of David's work and his approach to it.
And you and David share a rapport, not only with professional rapport, but one of friendship, correct? That you guys are am I reading that correctly, Giles?
Yeah, I mean, I hope I'm friends with most of the directors I work with.
Right.
Right. I think one of the beauties of having, they now refer to me as a veteran cinematographer, and I sort of feel like sticking my hand up in the air and saying, "Oh, hold on, I've only just learned how to do my job," and you're putting me out to pasture already. So but it is true that, like, if you're not friends with a director, then, and it's simply just a question of position and power, then it's quite hard to be openly creative, because you do need that confidence to be able to register your opinion, strive for something, explain something to the director, and expect a reasonable response rather than a response that just slaps you down. And like every other DP on the planet, or any other person that's worked under somebody else, there's always the possibility that your boss can just, strike you out and just say that's total nonsense and put you down. There was a great thing I listened to Chris Doyle when he was doing a lecture in Berlin, and he was talking about his relationship with Wong Kar-wai, and he just said his whole deal was that he would try and come up with 100 ideas a day, and it didn't matter to him whether Wong Kar-wai said that 99 of them were horrible, as long as that one got through. And I thought that was a really good thing in terms of being a DP, is that you sort of have to keep pushing that way. You don't have to keep demanding that a director does it your way. There are people that do that as well, but you have to continually come up with suggestions, and suggestions that could aid, and then the director, says yes or no. I think David and I from the beginning, we had a very, very close rapport in terms of understanding the material. There is a very specific thing that happens with David and myself, is that, and we're talking about doing another project together, and the producer said to me recently, so how do you see the look? And I said, well, David and I don't really talk about that. We don't talk about the look. We talk about the script. So we talk about the script. We tend to spend a week together. Normally he comes and joins me. I used to live in France, but now I live in Spain. So he comes and joins me. We go through the scripts scene by scene, sometimes breaking it down in terms of shots, sometimes not, but basically talk about where the emotional heart of each scene, and obviously the narrative point of each scene is. And so with that comprehension, it means that the actual style will develop from that. And the style develops either semantically or creatively in a sort of separate space. But the only way we get to that point is by me really understanding the script that he's either written or he's been involved in writing for a long time.
Yeah, that's well said. And I have a couple questions around Hell or High Water. I had a guest on, I want to say 6 months ago, maybe a year ago now, Giles, that I have to say that your name was brought up in the interview. His name is Dylan Keenan. He plays the state trooper when Chris Pine gets pulled over at the roadblock in Hell or High Water.
Yeah. No, a big tall guy.
Yes, and he brought up your name, and I had the clip ready to go, but to save time, he basically said the way he approached the car, you had handed him a note, to basically say, look, this is kind of the way you were trying to help him out on how to approach the car. And his biggest regret was, he said, when I watched the movie and I listened to what Giles had said, I wish I took his advice, because I really feel like, not that it cost him the scene, but I think and he would have said this, not heeding your advice, I think could have made this scene phenomenal. Like, I think he's hard on himself for it. He was basically like, I should have listened to Giles. And after I saw the final product, I saw what Giles was trying to tell me. And it was he just was oozing respect when it came your way. And, I just thought you should have heard that. It was just the way he said that, you had absolute control of that scene, and your vision turned out to be the right one. He was really hard on himself that he did not listen to what you had told him.
Yeah, but I also think it's quite complicated and I think this is one of the big things that does actually separate DPs, in the sense that, and I only know this as hearsay because obviously I've worked with a lot of directors that have worked with a lot of DPs who are very, very good DPs, but they also come with a certain amount of, I'm not going to say overconfidence, but a certain amount of insistence in terms of the way working, that we all need to work. There's the famous story of Gordon Willis, who in his contract supposedly had control over the actors' movements. And so whenever Francis Ford Coppola would say something, in terms of an actor being in a different place, he would sort of remind Francis that he has an open return first class ticket back to Los Angeles. And it's one of those tales, obviously exaggerated, but it's true that there's a point where certain DPs had sort of total control in that way, but obviously because they were talented people and they worked very well with the directors. And I've never really been part of that world. I mean, one, because I don't have the stature to be able to do that, but also I have too much respect for the directors I work for and for the actors in terms of giving them as much liberty. There's a point where you have to. You could lose everything by not having a certain amount of control. But the regrets that I have in the system is when I've actually insisted that an actor either take a position or do something for the camera that was not natural. Because I would sit there and I'd watch the film and thinking, Jesus, I should never have said that to that particular actor, because that was, overall, that there was something missing from that scene, or there was something that was not quite natural, because it's not a thing that person would have done naturally. And so it's something, and there's very few times that that's happened to me, but if I have any regrets, that would be that. Not because I haven't done a perfect job in lighting. I'd much prefer to take a few compromises in terms of lighting and give the actor that freedom than control those things. I think in that particular case, in Hell or High Water, because I know what it was about, we'd started off with a big Technigrain shot, and then the whole thing was about menace. That's what it was. It was about Chris Pine, who's been shot, and it's about menace because he's could potentially be caught by there. So if the whole scene's about menace, then we have to build that up in terms of images, in terms of menace. Everything that the camera does, from the reveal to the police cars, from Chris sweating, from the way that the policeman approaches is extremely important. And it was already in there in the scene, and obviously in the scene under David's direction, but there was a way of visually enhancing that by looking at Chris, but obviously seeing the reflection of the policeman. And the policeman had to do some very, very uncomfortable maneuvering, because when he was approaching the car, it wasn't from where he should be approaching from. And I think that's where it's sort of difficult for an actor, because I'm asking an actor to do something completely unnatural, even though in that specific case, I was sure about why it was going to help, because it was going to enhance, obviously, the risk and the danger to Chris's character. But it's a very tricky one. I think that's very, very tricky. And I think there's only you can only sort of do that if you have a certain level of rapport with the actors, or obviously with the director. And the great thing about Hell or High Water, and I always say this is why it turned out to be such a good film, was that there was I thought, Chris, Ben, David, and myself were very, very, very much in sync. And I think, and it is also about sort of, four men in a desert type thing. But I do think that helped massively, that there was enough tension, but enough comprehension between us. And of course, we all liked each other, and I think everybody appreciated the quality of every other person. And that really helped us massively, I think, because we had a great shoot because of that.
Yeah, and you have an actor like Jeff Bridges, right, who is just notorious for, he wears his emotions on his face, the way he does it, his body language. As a cinematographer, I mean, are you ever taken back by how good some of these actors you work with are? I mean, because I watched Jeff Bridges, just his facial expressions, the way he looks like he's in pain or in doubt or angry or sad, like the way he wears his emotions, the way he conducts his body language. I mean, you watching all this, you have to be blown away by. I mean, this is like a cinematographer's dream, I would imagine.
Yeah. So there's a different. I mean, with Jeff, it's very different, because Jeff, you just have this massive amount of respect for Jeff's past and his abilities. So in a way, we sort of had these two shoots, because Chris was only with us for the first 11 days, and he crossed only on one day with Jeff. And so we were running very, very fast on the first 11 days, because Chris was going off to do Star Wars. So we had all of the bank robberies had to happen in the first week, basically. So we had to really start really, really fast. And the thing that was sort of incredible was that when Chris left, we obviously had to then start up a different rhythm, which was between Jeff and Gil, because their scenes have a different rhythm. They're people that are not so much Gil, but they're older, and their relationship is much more staid. Doesn't have any of that, male energy that the two brothers have. And so it was a film in two rhythms. And Jeff was very open from the beginning, and he also wants to know what's going on. And I was very happy to tell him. It was a very wonderful thing when he turned up on his first day, and we were doing the scene after the first robbery in the film, where Jeff goes in and talks to the teller that's been threatened by the two brothers. And that's the first film. And we always wanted to do all of those scenes within that place. We always wanted to do in one shot, but it went through a revolving doorway, so we had to break it up into two shots, and then it was sort of cut in the edit with the two boys in there. And Jeff, we wanted to do the first thing. We wanted to try to repeat that and do a single shot that went in there, which we'd have to then cut through the doorway, and then all of the stuff while he's doing his investigating there. And Jeff came up. He said, "So what are we going to do? What are we going to do?" And I said, "Jeff, we're going to do this Steadicam. We're going to have to cut it in the middle, but we really wanted to have done one shot, and then we're going to do it all in two shots." And he looked at me and he just sort of said, "Oh yeah, that's really great. So we're really going to get through and do it one shot." And I said, "And then as soon as we've got the takes, I'm going to put it on my shoulder and shoot the shit out of it." And he just looked at me, and we didn't know each other, and he just looked at me. He went, "Got it." And so, and the important thing was that the intention to do it in that way, and in fact, there is very, very little of the coverage did handheld. In that, I think there's literally only one shot in the later part of that scene. So, and it all came out of the developing Steadicam shot, and different takes, obviously. But it gave Jeff an idea about our approach to it, our desires to do that in terms of real time and with the fluidity and get the performance very, very fluid. And then, of course, there is the potential that we're going to have to bump in there. But at least that way you can pace yourself. But it's an amazing opportunity to look at somebody like Jeff doing things like that, and what he can do on each particular take. There's also an interesting thing about the great thing about watching great actors is watch them not do things that are continuous. So that on each take, and I remember this even when I was a focus puller, we did a film with Anthony Hopkins, which was sort of a nightmare because Anthony was never in the same place twice. And Andrew used to look on long lenses wide open. So it was a real, focus for Andrew was quite hard. But there was something, when I remember looking at that even as an assistant and thinking, well, the amazing thing about this is there's no two takes the same. And I know lots of people freak out because they think, well, how am I going to cut it together? But David doesn't think that. What David thinks is, and I remember talking to him about digital. I was saying, well, David, isn't it great that, on digital, maybe in the future, if it's 8K, you can just sort of push in so you can have your mid shot and your close up, out with it, with perfect continuity. You just bump in because you're going to zoom in optically. Let's not talk about perspective and things like that. But in terms of a get out of jail free, a lot of people had talked about that originally with digital, about the idea. And we did a lot of it on Star Wars. We bumped in for close-ups. Digitally, and David looked at me and said, well, why on earth would I want to do that? I just want as many different performances as possible. And I thought that was such a healthy attitude towards that. I put the technicality to one side and give me loads of alternatives. And actually that's what I sort of hear from most really good and really established actors. I mean, to the point that I've heard an actor a very good actress say to a first-time director, but an actress as well, saying, "Don't worry about it, dear. I'll give you 5 takes, and you just pick the one you like." Which it was slightly condescending, but that's what she sort of did. But also the indication was, I'm going to give you 5 different takes. I'm going to give you 5 possibilities. And I think that liberty and having a director that takes on that liberty and is prepared to risk that in terms of the potential of having a continuity issue is really wonderful. I mean, and I think that's what creates those moments. When actors are liberated, they're given the dialogue and then they're liberated, that's when they produce magic.
Yeah, that's so much detail that I never would have realized. One of the things I love, Giles, is when cinematography and the film score really just complement each other and work like magic. And for me, the best scene in the movie, and it's not, this is a movie filled with stunning cinematography, but it's the scene after Ben Foster Tanner is killed. Chris Pine is in a casino. Toby's in a casino, and he puts his hat on, and then it's maybe my favorite shot of yours in the movie. He's leaving in his car, and the way you pan that camera to show the car leaving, then it goes to show that he's got one headlight out, and the music by Nick Cave and Warren Ellis, it's just magic. That whole from when he's at the casino watching television to when he's in his car leaving. I don't know what it is about that scene, but it hits me hard.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a practical thing that comes out of David's work is that David's very, and I work for another director called Michael Winterbottom, and there's no sort of wasted time. There's no possibility at which you could limit the potential to get a good shot, whether it's working with the light. And so both David and Michael Winterbottom give me as a DP the possibility of catching things in amazing light, because we're also prepared to take the risk that, there's a discontinuity in light. So you're doing some things, and some things are done very rapidly and that rapidity often means that wherever your framing is, and I've always had this thing slightly about framing is instinctive. You can't, and that's why I operate. Not because I'm the best mechanical operator on the planet, but simply because there's a certain comprehension. I've been living with the script. I've been living with the director. I've been living with the actors. There's a comprehension about what I can add to a scene with composition. And sometimes it's just about force of composition. Other times it's actual narrative content. And so a lot of the time with David, I think we shoot things sort of so fast that it's very instinctive, and it's very instinctive between the two of us because we both know what we're aiming for. And that's why those things work extremely well with David, because he gives me that liberty.
Two questions left for you, Giles. Thank you for all this time. Yeah. Is there a scene that works for you? And I mean, I'm sure they all work for you, but is there a scene that really, so I just gave you an example of a scene that just blows me away. Is there one, I'm sure there's many, but is there one in particular in Hell or High Water that really blows you away, that you're just really, that gets you more than the rest?
No, what I think is, and I think there are things that it's very difficult for a DP to separate, how lighting has worked in terms of enhancing a scene, for example, or the construction of the scene. Some of the scenes are quite simply constructed because we had a fair bit of dialogue, and particularly with Jeff and Gil, it was a lot of there's a lot of exposition within their communication. So sometimes it had to be simple construction, with hopefully interesting looking framing. Sometimes it was simple that within the framing we had to actually have, a narrative importance. And it was very interesting when, on digital, because when we put the camera up, the first AC puts the camera up and generally slaps a stop on it just so that we can see something. As he's put it up on the dolly. And there was a very interesting thing where we were in the where we were looking outside towards a bank that was outside, and it's in the scene where the two guys, it's the same location where the two guys meet the waitress that offers them steak or steak, which is a very well-known scene. And the assistant automatically put 2.8 on it, and obviously the outside went out completely because that's how it looked inside in terms of the amount of illumination that was inside. So I got on the camera because we tend not to rehearse, and we turn over and I slap 8 onto the lens, and he literally doesn't understand, and that's it. He did something that was totally normal, and but couldn't believe that I was shooting at 8 with 2 silhouettes up against the bank that was the narrative point of the scene. So that's a sort of different thing, is trying to hold in your head all that time that whatever you do, it's all about the narrative. And sometimes, David had that, and I had that debate about how far we could actually take them in terms of silhouettes, when the important thing was what they were talking about outside the window.
Yeah, and I still can't believe this movie's 6 years old. I can't believe it. I feel like I saw it in a theater yesterday, Giles. I can't believe it.
That's good.
No. For those listening, you've done so many wonderful things. Enola Holmes, Think Like a Dog. What's it? I'm sure you've gotten this question thousands of times before, but the unpredictability of animals, it must be a cinematographer. It must keep you you must go through quite a lot of bottles of Tylenol when it comes to shooting animals, their unpredictability. I know there's people on set to contain them, but again, I feel like I've heard other cinematographers, not you, say, they have lines about, small kids and animals, they can be unpredictable. Do you find that to be the case?
Yeah, that particular job, it was because a friend of mine was directing it. And it fitted in between 2 films with Michael Winterbottom, it was great. But also I hadn't shot in a stage for a long time, and we were going to build a house. And I actually think the work I did, I'm very, very pleased with the work I did on a film that is a very simple family film that didn't have any great success. And obviously it is interesting. For me, it was interesting, the idea to have some experience working with animals, which obviously we worked a lot with horses. But working with a dog, frankly, I just found it very, very frustrating. I thought the dog was a bit dumb. But apparently they are. Labradoodles are a little dumb. So I just found it sort of we had 2 of them, and they were just very, very frustrating. But that's part of it. I don't find the same thing about children, because I've had I've worked with very, very good children. So they've always amazed me. It's that thing you were talking about with actors, generally. What the biggest pleasure I have, I think, now in my career is the fact that I know enough about my job so that it's just a creative process. It's not a technical process anymore. So actually completing the day, getting enough done, knowing how to get round a corner to make a sequence work, or the compromises you might have to make in terms of lighting so that you can actually get what's needed for the edit. So all of that goes to one side. But the beauty of everything that I do now is that I normally have enough free time in my head, because it's linked into the creative process, to actually watch what happens with actors. And they continue to amaze me, whether they're children or not. I've done 2 films with Millie Bobby Brown. And one of the, I really enjoy working for Legendary. I really enjoy working for Harry Bradbeer. But the great pleasure of doing that film is working with Millie Bobby Brown. And that because she just has she's extremely bright and has an amazing talent, so that you can put her in any sort of situation and she can act her way out of it. And it's a really beautiful thing to watch. And I feel very privileged when I have that free space, if you like, that free headspace, to be able to watch and understand what she's creating out of that character. And when you see actors like that, and this has happened to me in India as well, actors that can play with a camera, that understand what's happening on the technical side of it so they can play enhance something. Millie did a fantastic thing, which was not scheduled, was that on one point in a street scene, she finished the scene, and I think she forgot the last bit of dialogue, and she left the camera, and instead of just cutting and saying, coming back and redoing it, she just came back and popped her head right in front of the camera, in a big close up on a wide lens, did her line and then left. And it's absolutely wonderful. And of course it's in the film. And, fortunately I had a good enough first AC to be alert and get her sharp. So it was, those sort of things, when you see that confidence, and you see that she was 15 at the time, you see that confidence in a young actress, it's just a remarkable thing to watch.
It's crazy that we've grown up. I think the first time I saw her was when she was 9 or 10, and to see how she's evolved, it's just, you're right. Your words are perfect. It's just amazing. We recently saw Montana's Story. What a beautifully shot film that was. I want to end on this note. Yep. You mentioned Star Wars twice. Anything you want to say, because obviously Kenobi is on Disney Plus. I mean, you worked, for those listening, you worked on episode 2 and 3, Attack of the Clones, and Revenge of the Sith.
I actually did Phantom Menace. I was second unit for 17 weeks on that. And then George always did, by the time we'd got to the second, they always said that we were very, very expensive on the second unit, because basically we were running 5 cameras, 3 of them were VistaVision. So for 1 or 2 frames of R2 to go into an optical effect, it was costing, we were burning through a lot of film. I do remember the first day of Star Wars. I think the first day of Star Wars, we shot 53,000 feet of film.
Wow.
Between the 2 units. So, first day shoot, it was like a crazy, when you actually calculate how long the 4 or 5 cameras are running, it was a lot of material. So when they did 2 and 3, I don't know, I suppose they're 5 and 6 now. They I don't quite know how it works out. George and Rick McCallum had worked out that actually running a second unit wasn't actually the best way of doing it. The best way was of shooting for 50 days on the main unit in Australia, which he did with David Tattersall on both films, and then going back to the edit room and allowing that there was a budget there to come back either once or twice. I think it was twice on the second film, and then once on the last film, Revenge of the Sith, to do maybe 6 days of shooting with the actors, and we did them in Elstree. We did them back in London. So David shot episodes 2 and 3, 5 and 6, I don't know, and then we would have this other week, and I would have that week. For me, that was a fantastic thing, because at that point I was working directly with George. So even though I was following obviously David Tattersall's lead, and we'd flipped to digital because the first one was film and the other 2 were not digital but high definition, then that was a great experience for me to come back and work with the same actors. Obviously, I'd done other films with Ewan McGregor, so I had at least I knew the actors, and the actors were super, super respectful to me, even though I'd been a second unit DP on the first one. So that was a really amazing experience for me to do something of that scale.
Yeah, that's awesome. And before I let you go, what's around the corner for you? Anything you could throw out there? I know there's Enola Holmes 2 in the mix. Whatever you could say about that would certainly be appreciated. What is on your horizon, Giles?
So we have literally one day of pickups and then the DI for Enola to do, Enola 2, which is a much bigger film. It's a much more complex film. It's been received very well so far, everybody that's seen it. And we have high hopes for it, but it's very, very similar in the vein of Enola Holmes 1. It retains all of the charm, all the characters, both Millie, all of the actors work really, really well together, with her mother, Helena Bonham Carter, and obviously with Sherlock. So it's a very, I think they've done an extremely, extremely good job with the script and an extremely good job in the edit, to make a film that is worthy of the first film. So certainly it's as likable, but it's more complex, and it's certainly got more of a detective type thing because obviously Millie's 2 years older, and she's out in the real world on her own. I can't really tell you more than that, obviously, because of the plot. But very successful thing to have gone back and done another time with the same director, with the same producers, with the same actors. And a fantastic pleasure for me, and I personally think it's better for my work than the first time. We achieved a lot more.
Wow. I got to tell you, I am so very happy that you came on today, Giles. I'm a huge fan, and I love your work, and I couldn't be any happier now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for listening to Derek Thomas and Monday Morning Critic Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, you can also connect with Monday Morning Critic on Instagram and Facebook, MDM Critic on Twitter, subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever podcasts are found. All episodes available, www.mmcpodcast.com.